The clothes you're wearing, the home you live in, your education, healthcare, and basic rights all were fundamentally transformed by what happened in Victorian Britain between 1837 and 1901. This wasn't just another period in history, it was the birth of our modern world. In this video, we'll reveal how the unprecedented wealth generated by the British Empire and Industrial Revolution created extreme social division, where the rich lived in opulence while the poor endured conditions we can hardly imagine today. More importantly, we'll show how this inequality sparked the social reforms and revolutionary ideas that still shape our lives in the 21st century. The Victorian era dawned on June 20th, 1837, as the young Princess Alexandrina Victoria was awakened at Kensington Palace with news that would forever alter the course of British history. Her uncle, King William IV, had died, making the 18-year-old the sovereign ruler of the most powerful nation on earth. Within hours, Victoria met with the Privy Council alone, a bold statement of independence that set the tone for what would become a transformative period in world history. This momentous transition occurred during a time when Britain stood at a crossroads. The world's first industrial nation was experiencing growth unprecedented in human history. Steam engines roared in factories across the nation, powering textile mills, ironworks, and countless other industries that formed the backbone of British economic might. Coal production had soared from 10 million tons annually at the beginning of the century to over 30 million by Victoria's coronation, fueling not just industry, but a revolution in transportation as railways began crisscrossing the countryside. Britain in 1837 was a nation of stark contrasts. While industrialization created enormous wealth, it simultaneously produced devastating poverty. The 1832 Reform Act had expanded voting rights to portions of the middle class, but still left approximately 95% of adults, including all women and working-class men, without political representation. The aristocracy and landed gentry maintained their grip on power through the House of Lords, even as industrial capitalists began accumulating fortunes that rivaled ancient family estates. The empire Victoria inherited was already vast, but would expand dramatically during her reign. British territories spanned from Canada to the Caribbean, India to Australia, with strategic outposts across Africa. The East India Company effectively controlled the Indian subcontinent, while settler colonies in Australia were rapidly expanding. This imperial power brought unprecedented resources, exotic goods, and global influence to British shores, but also carried moral responsibilities that would increasingly trouble Victorian consciences. Religious revival movements were dramatically reshaping British society as Victoria took the throne. Evangelicalism emphasized personal salvation, moral rectitude, and social reform, influencing both the Church of England and nonconformist denominations. This religious fervor drove campaigns against perceived moral failings, from alcohol consumption to prostitution, while simultaneously inspiring humanitarian efforts to address poverty, illiteracy, and labor exploitation. Sunday schools had become a central institution, teaching not just religious doctrine, but basic literacy to working-class children. Technology transformed daily life at an astonishing pace. Gaslighting illuminated city streets and fashionable homes, making nighttime activities increasingly common. The telegraph had begun to revolutionize communication, while advances in printing technology produced cheaper books, magazines, and newspapers for a growing literate population. Photography, invented just before Victoria's accession, would soon create entirely new ways of documenting the world and understanding visual culture. London itself had become a metropolis unlike anything previously seen in human history. By 1837, its population exceeded 1.5 million, making it not just Britain's capital, but the largest and most influential urban center in the world. Its docks processed goods from across the globe. Its factories produced everything from furniture to firearms, and its financial institutions bankrolled development throughout the empire and beyond. Yet, this remarkable urban expansion brought unprecedented challenges: overcrowding, pollution, disease, and poverty on a scale that demanded new approaches to urban governance. The Victorian period began with the spirit of confidence that bordered on hubris. Britain saw itself as the workshop of the world, a beacon of progress and civilization destined to spread enlightenment through commerce, technology, and imperial governance. This self-assured nationalism fueled both remarkable achievements and profound ethical failures in the decades to come. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships shortened distances and connected continents, while scientific discoveries expanded human understanding of everything from evolution to electricity. Behind this facade of national progress and technological triumph lay a society carved into such distinct strata that a Victorian could identify someone's precise social standing from a single glance at their boots. The class system wasn't simply about wealth. It created parallel universes where people living mere feet apart might never truly interact, their lives governed by rules so complex that an entire industry emerged just to teach the newly wealthy how not to embarrass themselves. Victorian Britain was divided into three rigorously defined social classes. At the pinnacle stood the aristocracy and landed gentry, comprising barely 2% of the population, yet controlling nearly 75% of the nation's land. These families, often with titles stretching back generations, maintained country estates where they lived off rental income and investments, rarely engaging in what they considered the distasteful world of actual labor. Their children received classical educations at elite institutions like Eton or Harrow before proceeding to Oxford or Cambridge, not primarily for career preparation, but for forming social connections with fellow elites. The rapidly expanding middle class represented a revolutionary force in Victorian society. Comprised of doctors, lawyers, clergymen, merchants, factory owners, and shopkeepers, this growing segment embodied the virtues of industry, thrift, and respectability. Their homes became showcases of moral propriety and material success, filled with ornate furniture, pianos, and decorative objects that demonstrated both wealth and taste. Middle-class families obsessively maintained appearances, knowing that social acceptance depended on visible adherence to strict behavioral codes. The middle class typically lived in new suburban developments specifically designed to separate them from both aristocratic squares and working-class neighborhoods. For the vast working class, nearly 80% of the population, Victorian Britain offered a harsher reality. Industrial laborers, miners, dock workers, and agricultural laborers endured 12 to 16-hour workdays in dangerous conditions. Their homes and urban rookeries often consisted of a single room housing entire families, with multiple families sharing outdoor toilets and water pumps. Disease spread rapidly through these cramped quarters, contributing to dramatically shorter lifespans. Working-class children rarely attended school past age 10, instead entering factories or service to help support their families. Their speech patterns, clothing, and even physical appearance marked them as distinctly different from their social betters. The boundary between classes was policed through countless visible and invisible markers. Clothing functioned as an immediate class identifier. A gentleman's tailored wool suit and silk top hat contrasted sharply with a laborer's rough cotton garments. Accents and vocabulary revealed one's background instantly, with pronunciation differences so distinct that people from different classes sometimes struggled to understand each other despite speaking the same language. Even physical posture and manners of walking were class-specific, trained into children from their earliest years. Despite rigid stratification, the Victorian era saw unprecedented, if limited, social mobility. Some industrialists rose from humble origins to enormous wealth, while the expanding civil service and colonial administration created new pathways for middle-class advancement. The nouveau riche, however, often discovered that money alone couldn't buy acceptance. This created demand for etiquette manuals and finishing schools, teaching everything from which fork to use to how to properly introduce people of different ranks. As one popular guide warned, quote, "It is better to be quietly correct than ostentatiously elegant." The wealthy displayed their status not just through possessions, but through charitable works, which simultaneously demonstrated their fortune and moral virtue. Philanthropy became an expected duty of the privileged classes, though it typically came with strict conditions. Recipients of charity might be required to attend religious services, sign temperance pledges, or demonstrate deserving status through proper deference and gratitude. The Victorian middle-class home wasn't merely a dwelling, but a carefully constructed moral fortress. Here, the family unit became almost a religious institution, with the hearth as its altar and domesticity its creed. The famous Victorian saying that, quote, "a man's home is his castle," wasn't just an expression. It represented a fundamental belief that domestic space provided spiritual protection from the corrupting influences of industrial society. Middle-class families invested tremendous resources in creating homes that reflected this ideal, with separate rooms dedicated to specific functions: parlors for receiving guests, drawing rooms for women, studies for men, and nurseries sequestered on upper floors. The physical layout of Victorian homes reinforced their moral purpose. Front entrances with imposing doors separated the public street from private domestic space. Windows facing the street featured heavy drapes that could be closed against prying eyes. Inside, corridors and staircases were designed to allow servants to move through the house without disturbing or being seen by family members. Even plumbing reflected moral values. Indoor bathrooms were carefully hidden away, acknowledging bodily functions while concealing them from view. Marriage, as the foundation of this domestic sanctuary, became intensely regulated by social expectations and legal frameworks that heavily favored men. A respectable wife managed the household and embodied what poet Coventry Patmore called the angel in the house, pure, selfless, and morally superior while simultaneously subservient to her husband. When marriage failed, women faced devastating consequences. Before the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, divorce required an act of Parliament, making it accessible only to the wealthy. Even after reform, men could divorce wives for adultery alone, while women had to prove additional offenses like cruelty or desertion to obtain the same relief. The obsession with propriety extended to every aspect of domestic life. Language was carefully controlled. Table legs became limbs. Chickens had white meat and dark meat rather than breasts or thighs. And even pregnancy was rarely mentioned directly, with euphemisms like "in an interesting condition" used instead. This linguistic modesty reflected broader anxieties about sexuality that paradoxically coexisted with an underground market in pornography and prostitution. The famous 1834 Obscene Publications Act targeted not only explicit materials, but also information about contraception, reflecting concerns that such knowledge might undermine family stability. For the middle class, displaying the right possessions became essential to claiming respectability. Homes needed to showcase specific objects, a piano in the parlor, religious texts prominently displayed, quality furniture with the fashionable ornamentation of the period. These items weren't just decorative, but served as visible proof of moral character. Families sometimes maintained elaborate facades while privately struggling with debt, prioritizing appearances over financial stability. A respectable middle-class home required at least one servant, and families would often sacrifice necessities to maintain this crucial marker of status. Victorian society's contradictions appeared nowhere more starkly than in its treatment of women. The same culture that claimed to revere women as morally superior beings denied them basic rights, education, and autonomy, all while being headed by a queen who condemned women's rights activists. This paradox shaped the lives of every Victorian woman, from factory worker to aristocrat. The legal status of married women was particularly shocking by modern standards. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife's legal existence was considered covered by her husband's. Upon marriage, a woman surrendered not only her property and earnings, but her very legal personhood. If her husband chose to take their children and abandon her, she had no legal recourse to recover them. Husbands could legally confine wives to asylums if they were deemed troublesome, and marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. While the law treated all women as subordinate, daily life varied dramatically by class. Wealthy women managed large households and engaged in approved social activities, but were barred from meaningful education or careers. Their days were filled with ritualized social calls, charity work, and entertainments, always chaperoned until marriage. The physical constraints were equally rigid, with fashionable corsets reducing waist to as little as 16 inches, causing internal organ damage and breathing difficulties. For working-class women, Victorian ideals of femininity were simply impractical luxuries. These women toiled in factories, worked as domestic servants, took in laundry, or sold goods on streets, all while bearing and raising numerous children. A cotton mill worker might labor 14 hours a day while pregnant, returning to work days after giving birth. Meanwhile, 1 in 3 working-class women in London worked in domestic service, facing isolation, sexual harassment, and constant scrutiny of their moral character. Female education remained strictly limited throughout much of the Victorian period. Girls from privileged backgrounds received instruction primarily in accomplishments designed to attract husbands, playing piano, watercolor painting, singing, and needlework. Intellectual pursuits were actively discouraged as potentially damaging to female reproductive health, with doctors warning that challenging mental work could cause infertility or hysteria. When Bedford College opened in 1849 as the first higher education institution for women, it faced ridicule and opposition. Despite these constraints, a women's rights movement gradually emerged. In 1855, Caroline Norton, separated from her abusive husband and denied access to her children, successfully campaigned for the Infant Custody Act, allowing mothers limited access to children under 7. Barbara Bodichon led the campaign for married women's property rights, while Josephine Butler fought against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to arrest suspected prostitutes for mandatory examinations while leaving their male clients untouched. The literary world provided another arena for challenging gender roles. Female authors like Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot, the pen name of Marianne Evans, created heroines who defied conventional expectations of female behavior. These writers often published under male pseudonyms to ensure their work would be taken seriously. Their novels questioned women's limited options and portrayed female characters with intellectual depth and moral complexity rarely acknowledged in Victorian society. Slowly, legal reforms began to chip away at these restrictions. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gradually allowed women to maintain control of their own earnings and property after marriage. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce more accessible, though still heavily biased against women. By the end of Victoria's reign, women had gained limited access to education, with women's colleges established at Oxford and Cambridge, though full membership at these universities remained decades away. Beneath the grand legal reforms and social movements that slowly reshaped Victorian Britain lay the mundane yet fascinating texture of everyday life. Would you believe that a Victorian Londoner could send a morning letter inviting a friend to dinner and receive their reply by afternoon, all while maintaining a schedule so precise you could set your watch by their movements? The Victorian day began early for most Britons. In industrial towns, factory whistles pierced the dawn air at 5:30 a.m., calling workers to their stations. By 6 a.m., streets teemed with carts, vendors setting up market stalls, and workers rushing to avoid the punishments that came with tardiness. For many laborers, breakfast was a hasty affair, perhaps a slice of bread and dripping beef fat eaten while walking to work, or porridge prepared the night before. Time itself changed during this era. Before railways standardized timekeeping across Britain in 1847, each town kept its own local time based on the sun. The Great Western Railway first introduced railway time based on Greenwich Mean Time, compelling Victorians to synchronize their watches and creating a new national obsession with punctuality. Public clocks became civic monuments, and the pocket watch a treasured possession even among working men who saved for months to afford one. Food rhythms varied dramatically by class. The working poor shopped daily for whatever they could afford, often at day's end when prices dropped. Street vendors provided affordable takeaway meals, eel pies, baked potatoes, whelks, and pea soup. The penny restaurant emerged in the 1860s, offering a plate of meat and vegetables for those who could afford it. By the 1880s, fish and chip shops began appearing in industrial towns, providing hot, filling meals for workers heading home. For the middle and upper classes, each day unfolded as an elaborate ritual. A gentleman might begin with a substantial breakfast at 9 a.m., reading newspapers delivered by the first of many postal rounds. Ladies made social calls between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., leaving calling cards if the recipient was absent or, quote, not at home, a polite fiction meaning they were indisposed to visitors. Lunch at 1 p.m. was followed by business or shopping, then afternoon tea around 4 p.m., and dinner as late as 8 p.m. for the fashionable set. Clothing changes punctuated the day for the affluent. A middle-class woman might wear a morning dress for household duties, change to a walking dress for errands, don a tea gown for receiving afternoon visitors, and finally appear in evening dress for dinner. Men similarly shifted from morning coats to frock coats to formal evening attire. The working class made do with one set of everyday clothes, with perhaps a single Sunday best outfit carefully preserved for church and special occasions. Personal cleanliness presented daily challenges. Without indoor plumbing, most Victorians used washstands with porcelain basins and water pitchers. The elaborate process of heating water and carrying it upstairs meant full body bathing remained a weekly event at most. Public bathhouses opened in many towns by the mid-century, offering hot baths for a small fee to working people whose homes lacked facilities. The evening brought stark differences in leisure. Working-class families might gather in pubs, community living rooms where news was exchanged and politics debated. Middle-class households engaged in parlor games, reading aloud, or musical performances on the obligatory piano. By the 1880s, gas lighting had transformed evening activities, extending productive hours and allowing for more recreational time. Across all classes, Sunday represented a rhythm break, a day when factories fell silent and shops closed their shutters. Church attendance dropped from nearly 60% in the 1851 religious census to around 35% by 1900. But Sunday's special status remained largely intact through the century. Families walked in parks in their best clothes, and even the poorest households attempted a special Sunday dinner. As Victorian families enjoyed their Sunday leisure, the invisible hands that made their comfort possible rarely stopped working. The servant class, representing the largest occupation in Victorian Britain, lived in a paradoxical world where they touched the most intimate aspects of their employers' lives while being treated as if they weren't there at all. By mid-century, approximately 1 in 3 working women found employment in domestic service, creating a vast workforce that sustained the Victorian lifestyle. Behind every respectable household operated a carefully structured hierarchy. At prestigious addresses, the butler reigned supreme over male staff, while the housekeeper commanded female servants. These senior positions carried both status and responsibility. A butler might earn £50 annually with room and board, while ordinary household maids received as little as £6 to £12 yearly. The pecking order extended downward through ladies' maids, who attended directly to mistresses, housemaids, kitchen staff, and finally to the lowly scullery maids, who scrubbed pots and endured the harshest conditions. A servant's day began before dawn and often extended past midnight. Scullery maids might rise at 4:30 a.m. to light fires and boil water before others woke. Even in modest households with just 1 or 2 servants, the work never ceased. Floors needed scrubbing, grates required blacking, meals demanded preparation, and endless laundry awaited washing. The physical toll was immense. Many developed chronic health problems from hauling coal, water, and heavy linens up and down stairs countless times daily. The psychological burden could be equally crushing. Servants existed in a strange limbo, physically present yet socially invisible. Many households enforced bizarre practices to maintain this illusion of invisibility. Some servants were forbidden from using the main staircase or instructed to face the wall when family members passed. The practice of servants entering rooms backwards demonstrated this determined erasure of their personhood. They were tools of comfort, not people to be acknowledged. Young girls typically entered service directly from working-class homes or workhouses. The position of maid of all work in smaller households was particularly brutal, combining every household task with complete isolation. Without the camaraderie found in larger establishments, these solitary servants often worked from 5 a.m. until 11 p.m., with only half a day off on Sundays, and sometimes not even that. Their sleeping quarters frequently consisted of kitchen floor pallets or damp cellar rooms. Despite proximity to well-stocked pantries, servants often survived on meager rations. While preparing roasts and fine desserts for their employers, many subsisted on bread, dripping, and weak tea. One household manual advised mistresses, quote, "Never allow your servants the same food as served at your table. It encourages ideas above their station." Yet pilfering food became a common form of resistance against such deliberate inequality. In larger establishments, servants created their own intricate social world below stairs. The servants' hall operated with its own strict codes and hierarchies. Upper servants might have their own quarters and privileges, while lower servants ate separately and were excluded from certain conversations. Romance bloomed despite restrictions, though female servants faced immediate dismissal without references if they became pregnant, a devastating prospect that often led to destitution. The relationship between masters and servants was complex. While some households treated staff with basic decency, most enforced rigid boundaries. Servants were expected to be unfailingly loyal and discreet, privy to family secrets, yet never acknowledging them. Their personal lives were heavily regulated. Most required permission to receive visitors or leave the premises during their limited free time. Employment could end instantly for infractions as minor as laughing too loudly or wearing hair in an inappropriate style. Beyond the confined world of domestic service lay the thundering heart of Victorian Britain's economic power, its factories. The relentless rhythm of machinery defined an age where Britain produced more manufactured goods than any other nation on earth. By the 1850s, British factories were turning out over half the world's iron and cotton cloth, with industrial centers like Manchester processing more cotton than all competing nations combined. The landscape of Britain transformed as factory chimneys rose above cities like Birmingham, Sheffield, and Glasgow. These industrial centers specialized in distinct products. Birmingham in metalworking and jewelry, Sheffield in steel and cutlery, Glasgow in shipbuilding. The textile industry concentrated in Lancashire and Yorkshire, while pottery dominated in Stratfordshire, creating regional identities tied to specific industries. Factory work bore little resemblance to traditional craftsmanship. Instead of skilled artisans completing entire projects, workers now performed repetitive tasks in a precisely coordinated system. In textile mills, one person might tend a specific machine for 12 hours straight, performing the same motion thousands of times per day. The noise was often so deafening that workers developed specialized sign languages to communicate over the roar of machinery. The physical toll was immense. Cotton mills generated fine dust that caused chronic respiratory diseases like bisonosis or brown lung. Iron foundries and glassworks subjected workers to extreme heat, causing heat exhaustion and burns. Chemical plants exposed workers to toxins that discolored their skin and destroyed their teeth. Machinery claimed fingers, hands, and limbs with horrifying regularity. A common sight in industrial towns was workers with missing digits or limbs, permanent reminders of industrial hazards. Women comprised much of the industrial workforce, especially in textiles and pottery. In Stratfordshire's potteries, women and girls performed detailed painting work, often ingesting lead-based glazes as they shaped brush tips with their lips. Female textile workers typically earned 40 to 60% less than men for similar work, justified by the prevailing belief that women worked only for pin money rather than to support families, a cruel fiction of countless widows and single women. The most controversial aspect of industrial employment was child labor. While children had always worked alongside parents in agricultural settings, factory labor was different, regimented, dangerous, and often supervised by strangers. Children as young as 5 worked as piecers in textile mills, crawling beneath running machinery to tie broken threads. In match factories, children dipped wooden sticks into phosphorus compounds that caused phossy jaw, a horrific condition where jawbones literally decayed while victims remained alive. Factory towns themselves were transformed environments. Streets were arranged in rigid grids to maximize efficiency, with identical workers' housing constructed by factory owners. Company towns like Saltaire, built by Titus Salt, Bourneville, created by the Cadbury family, represented more enlightened approaches, providing better housing, schools, and recreational facilities, though still under the watchful eye of the factory owner. The early Factory Acts attempted to address the worst abuses. The 1833 Act prohibited factory work for children under 9 and limited those under 13 to 8-hour shifts. Later legislation gradually restricted hours, improved safety requirements, and mandated basic education for child workers. However, these reforms faced fierce resistance from industrial interests. Factory inspectors were too few to enforce regulations effectively, and many factory owners simply ignored the law, using a system of warning bells to alert managers when inspectors approached. By the 1880s, the emergence of the new unionism movement began organizing previously ignored groups of unskilled factory workers. The infamous 1888 Match Girls strike at Bryant and May's London factory highlighted the dangerous working conditions of young women exposed to toxic phosphorus. Public outcry following their successful strike pushed more factories to adopt safer red phosphorus processes. Victorian factories symbolized both industrial triumph and human cost, simultaneously monuments to progress and sites of exploitation. They produced the consumer goods that defined material culture while demanding tremendous sacrifice from those who operated them. The juxtaposition of magnificent machinery and broken bodies created a profound contradiction at the heart of Victorian prosperity. These profound contradictions of Victorian prosperity didn't go unchallenged. What happens when millions of people who build an empire's wealth decide they deserve a say in how it's governed? The Chartist movement emerged in 1838 as an unprecedented phenomenon, the first time in British history that working-class people organized on a massive scale to demand political rights rather than just economic concessions. The movement coalesced around a document called the People's Charter, drafted by William Lovett and other working-class radicals who understood that without political representation, workers would remain powerless. Their demands were revolutionary in their simplicity: universal male suffrage, equal electoral districts, removal of property qualifications for members of Parliament, payment for MPs, annual parliamentary elections, and the secret ballot. At its core was a fundamental question: why should the people who produced Britain's wealth have no voice in its governance? Fergus O'Connor, a charismatic Irish lawyer turned radical, became Chartism's most recognizable leader. His newspaper, the Northern Star, reached a circulation of 50,000 copies weekly, an extraordinary number for the era, creating a national network of politically engaged workers. The paper served as both organizing tool and educational platform, helping working people understand how parliamentary reform connected to their daily struggles. Chartism's first national petition in 1839 gathered an astonishing 1.28 million signatures, at a time when Britain's entire population was about 18 million. When Parliament contemptuously rejected it without debate, the movement split between moral force Chartists, who advocated continual peaceful pressure, and physical force Chartists, who believed more dramatic action might be necessary. The Newport Rising of November 1839 demonstrated these tensions. When thousands of Welsh miners marched on Newport under the leadership of John Frost, troops opened fire, killing at least 22 protesters. The government responded with a wave of arrests. Frost and other leaders were initially sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the last time this medieval punishment was pronounced in Britain, though the sentences were later commuted to transportation to Australia. The second national petition in 1842 gathered even more support, over 3.3 million signatures, but was again rejected by Parliament. That same year, economic desperation fueled what became known as the plug plot riots across industrial regions. Workers removed the plugs from factory boilers, effectively shutting down production in hundreds of workplaces. The authorities responded with military force, leading to bloody confrontations in several towns. The final great Chartist petition came during the Revolutionary year of 1848, when monarchies across Europe were toppled by popular uprisings. The government, terrified of similar events in Britain, stationed 85,000 special constables throughout London to confront a planned Chartist demonstration. The gathering on Kensington Common drew tens of thousands, but remained peaceful, and the petition, claimed to hold 5 million signatures, though later counted at far fewer, was again rejected. After this defeat, Chartism gradually declined as a unified movement, but its legacy extended far beyond its formal existence. One by one, 5 of the 6 demands were eventually adopted into British law. The secret ballot came in 1872, payment for MPs in 1911, equal electoral districts through various reform acts, abolition of property qualifications in 1858, and near universal male suffrage by 1918. Only the demand for annual parliaments remains unimplemented. Chartism's significance lay in how it transformed ordinary working people into political actors. Women like Anne Knight and Mary Ann Walker formed female Chartist associations, challenging the movement's focus on male suffrage while advocating for broader women's rights. Chartist associations established reading rooms and offered political education, creating a generation of working-class leaders who went on to form trade unions, cooperatives, and mutual aid societies. This political awakening fueled broader social reforms. Lord Shaftesbury championed factory laws and mine safety regulations. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing and hospital design. Edwin Chadwick's investigations into public health led to sanitation improvements that saved countless lives. These middle and upper-class reformers were responding to pressure from below, the organized demands of workers who refused to accept that poverty and exploitation were natural conditions. In 1845, a microscopic pathogen arrived in Ireland that would forever alter the course of the nation's history. Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight, spread with terrifying speed across the island, turning healthy potato crops into rotting, blackened sludge almost overnight. For the average Irish tenant farmer, this wasn't merely an agricultural setback, but a death sentence. The potato wasn't just a dietary preference, it was survival itself, providing subsistence on tiny plots of land where no other crop yielded enough to feed a family. The British response to this catastrophe revealed the darker underpinnings of Victorian economic philosophy. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official overseeing relief efforts, infamously declared the famine, quote, "the judgment of God," and, quote, "the mechanism by which the Almighty has purported to teach the Irish a lesson in moral improvement." Such sentiments weren't fringe. They reflected the prevailing British belief in laissez-faire economics and moral culpability for poverty. The workhouses established as centers for relief required the surrender of all property and separated families upon entry, forcing proud farmers to choose between starvation or humiliation. Perhaps most damning was the continuous export of food from Ireland throughout the crisis. While people collapsed from hunger along roadsides, ships laden with Irish wheat, oats, and livestock departed regularly for English markets. In 1847 alone, the worst year of suffering known as Black 47, nearly 4,000 vessels carried food exports from Ireland to Britain. Armed guards often escorted these shipments past crowds of the starving. This reality fueled the bitter Irish saying, quote, "God sent the blight, but the English made the famine." The desperation drove many to unfathomable acts. Reports emerged of parents feeding children grass boiled with a little butter, of corpses with mouths stained green from eating nettles and weeds. In the west of Ireland, there were isolated accounts of the dying drinking blood from cattle to survive. Disease soon followed hunger. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, and scurvy ravaged populations already weakened by malnutrition. The dead often remained unburied, with survivors too weak to dig graves. Those who could flee did so in unimaginable conditions. The coffin ships earned their name honestly. Mortality rates aboard these overcrowded vessels sometimes reached 30%. The Lushtok, sailing to Quebec in 1847, saw 117 of its 462 passengers die at sea. Another ship, the Agnes, lost 50% of its passengers. Those who survived often faced discrimination and poverty in their new homes, clustering in urban slums like Boston's North End or Liverpool's Scotland Road. The cultural impact extended beyond demographics. The famine accelerated the decline of the Irish language, as those who fled were disproportionately from Gaelic-speaking regions. Traditional music, storytelling, and customs suffered similar blows. The Catholic Church, one of the few institutions that retained public trust through relief efforts, emerged with strengthened influence that would shape Irish society for generations. The political consequences were equally profound. Young Ireland's failed rebellion of 1848 may have faltered, but it planted seeds of nationalist sentiment that would grow into movements like the Fenian Brotherhood and eventually culminate in the Easter Rising of 1916. For many Irish, the famine permanently shattered any remaining faith in British governance. A poem published in the Nation newspaper in 1847 captured this sentiment. Quote, "We are wretches, famished, scorned, human tools to build your pride. But God will yet take vengeance for the souls for whom Christ died." International reaction revealed much about Victorian power dynamics. While American Quakers and other charitable organizations sent substantial aid, official British relief remained constrained by ideology. When the Ottoman Sultan Abdulmecid attempted his generous donation, British diplomats intervened to avoid embarrassing their queen. The Sultan reportedly then sent 3 ships of food to Drogheda Harbor in secret, a gesture commemorated by the town's adoption of the Turkish star and crescent in its football club's emblem. While charitable organizations struggled to combat famine in Ireland, a different silent killer was decimating Britain's own population. The rapid industrialization that had made Britain wealthy had also created perfect conditions for disease to flourish. In the crowded streets of London and Manchester, life expectancy plummeted to shocking levels. While rural residents might live to their 60s, industrial workers often perished before 40. What made this tragedy particularly striking was how preventable much of it was. Victorian cities were essentially giant petri dishes. Raw sewage flowed directly into the Thames and other urban rivers, the same waters from which drinking supplies were drawn. Open cesspools festered between buildings, while thousands of families shared a single outdoor privy. The smell was so overwhelming that in 1858, the Great Stink forced Parliament to suspend sessions when the stench from the Thames became unbearable. Members hung lime-soaked cloths over the windows in a futile attempt to block the odor. Most Victorian medical authorities believed in the miasma theory, that disease spread through foul air and noxious vapors. While this theory was scientifically incorrect, it inadvertently led to positive changes. City officials, convinced that bad smells caused illness, began tackling sanitation problems. The Metropolitan Board of Works commissioned engineer Joseph Bazalgette to design London's first comprehensive sewer system, an 1,100-mile network of underground tunnels that redirected waste away from the Thames. One man challenged the prevailing miasma theory through methodical investigation. In 1854, Dr. John Snow meticulously mapped cholera deaths in London's Soho district and traced the outbreak to a single water pump on Broad Street. By removing the pump handle, he halted the epidemic and demonstrated that contaminated water, not air, transmitted cholera. Though initially dismissed by medical authorities, his work eventually changed how disease was understood and combated. The Public Health Act of 1848 created the first National Health Board, though its powers were limited by Victorian reluctance to interfere with private property rights. Not until 1875 did a more comprehensive act pass, requiring local authorities to provide clean water, proper drainage, and regular waste removal. These reforms came too late for the countless victims of the 4 major cholera epidemics that struck Britain between 1831 and 1866. Victorian hospitals themselves were frequently death traps. Florence Nightingale famously documented that soldiers in military hospitals were more likely to die from preventable infections than from battle wounds. In civilian institutions, patients often shared beds, surgical instruments went unwashed between operations, and doctors moved directly from dissecting corpses to examining patients without washing their hands. The introduction of antiseptics by Joseph Lister in the 1860s represented a revolutionary breakthrough. By spraying carbolic acid during surgical procedures, Lister dramatically reduced post-operative infections. When he published his results in 1867, showing mortality rates dropping from 45% to 15%, many colleagues still ridiculed his methods. It would take decades for sterile procedures to become standard practice. For those who could afford to avoid hospitals, a thriving market of patent medicines offered dubious alternatives. Newspapers and magazines featured advertisements for miraculous cures, from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething babies, containing morphine, to burdock blood bitters for female complaints. These unregulated concoctions frequently contain dangerous ingredients: lead, mercury, arsenic, and various narcotics. The popular Daffy's Elixir, marketed to treat everything from colic to melancholy, was primarily gin with added laxatives. Women were particularly targeted by these pseudo-medical entrepreneurs. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound promised relief from, quote, all those painful complaints and weaknesses so common to our best female population. Though its 18% alcohol content likely provided temporary relief, its medical benefits were negligible. Similarly, Dr. Williams's pink pills for pale people claimed to cure everything from paralysis to, quote, female weakness, despite containing nothing more than iron oxide and sugar. Beyond the dangerous realms of Victorian snake oil and patent medicines lay another battlefield entirely: the struggle for knowledge itself. While wealthy families sent their sons to prestigious institutions like Eton and Harrow, the majority of Britain's children faced a stark reality. In 1840, less than 40% of children had any access to formal education. For millions of working-class families, schooling remained an unattainable luxury when every family member's labor was needed simply to survive. The educational landscape was fragmented and chaotic. Some poor children might attend dame schools, informal classes run by elderly women in their own homes, teaching basic reading for a few pennies per week. Others found places in ragged schools, charitable institutions established to provide rudimentary education to the most destitute children. These schools, often operating in converted warehouses or church basements, served children too poor, dirty, or ill-behaved to be accepted elsewhere. The quality of these institutions varied dramatically. One inspector described a typical dame school as, quote, a small, stuffy room, 20 to 30 children crowded together on benches, learning by rote from tattered books, under the supervision of an elderly woman whose qualification is often merely that she is too old for any other employment. In rural areas, education was even more limited, with agricultural work taking precedence over schooling, especially during harvest seasons. Middle-class boys received a vastly different education focused on classical subjects. The curriculum at public schools, like Rugby, emphasized Latin, Greek, and mathematics, subjects considered essential for developing mental discipline rather than practical skills. Girls from similar backgrounds received instruction primarily in accomplishments deemed suitable for future wives and mothers: music, drawing, needlework, and perhaps a smattering of French. One girls' school prospectus from 1845 promised to teach, quote, those branches of education calculated to form useful and pleasing members of society, without the pedantry of learned ladies. Everything changed with the Elementary Education Act of 1870, championed by William Forster. This watershed legislation established the first framework for nationwide schooling, requiring that elementary education be available to all children aged 5 to 13. School boards were established to build and manage schools in areas where provision was inadequate. By 1880, education became compulsory, and by 1891, it became free, though enforcement remained inconsistent, especially in areas where child labor was economically essential. The expansion of education created intense social tensions. Many factory owners resisted losing their child workers, while some parents could not afford to forego their children's wages. The Manchester School Board recorded numerous cases of evasion. Quote, Mary Smith, age 9, absent 43 days this quarter. Mother claims illness, but child seen working at mill. Attendance officers, nicknamed school board men, became dreaded figures in working-class neighborhoods as they pursued truants and prosecuted parents. Progressive women like Emily Davies and Frances Buss emerged as powerful advocates for girls' education. Buss founded the North London Collegiate School in 1850, pioneering academic instruction for girls that rivaled boys' schools. Davies established Girton College at Cambridge in 1869, fighting for women's right to university education despite fierce opposition. One member of Parliament famously declared that higher education would render women, quote, mannish and unseemly, warning that educated women would produce, quote, weak, precocious, and undersized children. Victorian schoolrooms were extraordinarily strict by modern standards. Corporal punishment was routine, with the cane, strap, or ruler administered for infractions from poor recitation to untidy handwriting. Children sat in rows, reciting by rote and copying from blackboards. Religious instruction formed a central part of the curriculum, with Bible reading and hymn singing starting each day. One Yorkshire schoolmaster's logbook noted, quote, caned William Brown for blasphemy. Memorization of 10 Commandments assigned as correction. Despite these harsh conditions, literacy rates soared dramatically. In 1841, only 67% of men and 51% of women could sign their own names. By 1900, these figures had risen to 97% and 96% respectively. This transformation created a voracious new reading public, hungry for material of all kinds. This newly literate Victorian society faced a question far more troubling than any spelling test. Could the old faith survive in an age of microscopes and fossils? Despite the appearance of a unified Christian nation, Victorian Britain was secretly experiencing a profound intellectual revolution that would transform how people understood their place in the universe. Christianity dominated Victorian life, with church attendance serving as the cornerstone of respectability. The Church of England stood as the established religion, but evangelical movements brought passionate new energy to faith practices. Religious observance wasn't merely personal, it shaped public policy, social interactions, and moral standards across society. Sunday was strictly observed as the Sabbath, with commerce halted and families attending morning and evening services. Beyond regular worship, religion penetrated everyday life through prayer meetings, Bible study groups, and charitable activities organized by local parishes. For the rising middle class especially, religious devotion provided both spiritual comfort and social standing. Biblical literacy wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Children memorized scripture from an early age, and religious texts were often the first books many Victorians owned. Yet, beneath this veneer of unified faith, the era witnessed extraordinary scientific advancements that challenged traditional religious explanations. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 triggered what many scholars call the Victorian crisis of faith. Darwin's theory of natural selection offered a mechanism for evolution that didn't require divine intervention. Organisms changed gradually over immense time periods through natural processes, not divine creation. This theory contradicted literal readings of Genesis and suggested humans shared ancestry with other primates rather than being specifically created in God's image. The implications extended beyond biology. Geologists like Charles Lyell had already demonstrated Earth was far older than the biblical timeline suggested, while archaeological discoveries questioned the historical accuracy of Scripture. These scientific revelations forced Victorians to reconsider their most fundamental beliefs about human origins and purpose. Many experienced profound spiritual turmoil, including Darwin himself, who had once studied to become a clergyman. Surprisingly, this era of scientific rationalism coincided with an explosion of interest in the supernatural. Spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living, gained enormous popularity, particularly after the American Fox sisters claimed to contact spirits in 1848. By the 1860s, seances had become fashionable social events where participants might witness table tipping, automatic writing, or materialized spirits. This movement offered particular appeal to women who often served as mediums and found in spiritualist circles a rare opportunity for public authority. Victorian interest in phenomena at the boundaries of science flourished in other ways too. Phrenology, reading character traits from skull shapes, was immensely popular, as was mesmerism, a forerunner to hypnotism. These pseudosciences occupied a middle ground, adopting scientific language while addressing spiritual concerns about human nature and consciousness. The Victorian fascination with pseudoscience wasn't their only obsession. They created entire languages out of objects, clothes, and table settings that spoke volumes about one's place in society. The same culture that held seances to contact the dead would develop the first modern department stores, transforming shopping from necessity into entertainment and social ritual. Before this revolution in retail, shopping meant visiting multiple specialized shops or dealing with street vendors. Purchasing goods typically involved haggling over prices in small, crowded establishments where merchandise was kept behind counters, accessible only to shopkeepers. The advent of department stores like Harrods, founded as a small grocer in 1849, and later Selfridges in 1909, introduced revolutionary concepts: fixed prices, open displays where customers could browse freely, and diverse goods collected under one roof. The Great Exhibition of 1851 accelerated this transformation in consumer culture. This unprecedented event, housed in the purpose-built Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, was a temple to industry and empire, displaying everything from massive industrial machinery to delicate handicrafts from colonial territories. Queen Victoria herself visited multiple times, writing in her journal of the wondrous beauty she encountered. Unlike previous exhibitions catering exclusively to elites, the Great Exhibition welcomed visitors from all classes. Workers' excursion trains brought people from across Britain to marvel at the technological wonders of their age. For the Victorian middle class, possessions became crucial markers of respectability and aspiration. The parlor or drawing room functioned as a carefully curated showcase of family status, filled with decorative items like figurines, potted plants, embroidered screens, and family photographs. Victorians coined the term bric-a-brac for these small ornamental objects that cluttered their homes, each item a statement about the family's taste and financial standing. Fashion operated as an equally elaborate social language. Women's silhouettes transformed dramatically throughout the era, from the bell-shaped crinolines of the 1850s and 60s requiring up to 40 yards of fabric, to the bustle-enhanced skirts of the 1870s and 80s. These weren't mere fashion trends, but visual embodiments of Victorian ideals about femininity, modesty, and status. A respectable middle-class woman needed multiple outfit changes daily, morning dress, walking dress, visiting dress, dinner dress, and evening attire for special occasions. Men's fashion appeared more uniform, but contained equally strict codes. The dark frock coat and top hat signaled business respectability, while the precise cut of a jacket or quality of a waistcoat communicated subtle differences in wealth and social position. Etiquette manuals proliferated, instructing readers on everything from proper glove wearing to the correct way to leave calling cards. The Victorian dining table transformed into perhaps the most elaborately coded space of all. Upper and middle-class dinner parties followed rigid protocols with multiple courses served in specific order. Isabella Beeton's famous Book of Household Management in 1861 became the Bible of proper dining, offering 2,751 entries covering everything from soup to pudding. Dinner tables groaned under multiple types of specialized utensils, fish knives, asparagus servers, grape scissors, each requiring specific knowledge to use correctly. Tea drinking evolved from simple refreshment to formalized ritual after the Duchess of Bedford introduced afternoon tea in the 1840s. This new social custom filled the long gap between lunch and dinner with delicate sandwiches, scones, and cakes presented on the finest china. Even for families of modest means, keeping a good tea service became essential for maintaining respectability. The most extraordinary Victorian status displays centered around exotic foods. Pineapples, originally grown in South America, became the ultimate luxury item in Britain. Cultivating them required expensive heated greenhouses, making each fruit cost the equivalent of thousands in today's money. Unable to afford purchase, many hosts instead rented pineapples purely for display at dinner parties, returning them afterward to specialized fruiterers who would then rent the same fruit to another status-conscious host. Beyond the elaborate social rituals of Victorian dining rooms lay another world entirely, one where factory whistles fell silent, where even the poorest laborer might find a few precious hours of freedom. The same era that glorified work as virtue would, paradoxically, give birth to the world's first true entertainment industry and the very concept of free time as we understand it today. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain's economy also revolutionized how ordinary people experienced time itself. Factory schedules divided the day with mechanical precision. Work hours and leisure hours became clearly delineated, creating something previously unknown to agricultural workers: predictable free time. By the 1870s, the Saturday half-holiday movement had gained significant ground, giving workers their first taste of the weekend. The expanding railway network transformed leisure possibilities for Victorians of all classes. Excursion trains carried over 25 million passengers annually by the 1860s, allowing factory workers to escape smoke-filled cities for seaside retreats. Brighton, once an exclusive playground for the wealthy, saw more than 250,000 day-trippers arrive on bank holidays. Coastal towns responded by building pleasure piers, promenades, and bathing machines that allowed modest Victorians to enjoy the sea while preserving their propriety. Music halls emerged as the quintessential working-class entertainment, with over 300 venues operating in London alone by 1870. For a few pennies, audiences enjoyed variety acts featuring comedians, singers, acrobats, and spectacles. Performers like Marie Lloyd became national celebrities, with songs filled with cheeky double entendres that cleverly sidestepped Victorian censorship laws. The rowdy atmosphere of these establishments, with their drinking, smoking, and audience participation, horrified middle-class reformers, but provided vital cultural spaces where ordinary people could forget their troubles. Sporting culture underwent a remarkable transformation during this period. Games that had existed as unregulated folk traditions became codified with standardized rules. The Football Association was established in 1863, rugby in 1871, and lawn tennis in 1877. Cricket expanded from an aristocratic pastime to a national passion with county championships beginning in the 1870s. By the 1880s, professional football clubs were drawing crowds of 30,000 spectators, with working men paying a week's beer money to support their local teams. The Victorian home became its own entertainment center. Parlor games like charades, blind man's bluff, and snapdragon, where players plucked raisins from burning brandy, filled winter evenings. Musical performances around the piano became central to middle-class gatherings, with sheet music sales reaching unprecedented levels. The stereoscope, a device that created three-dimensional images from specialized photographs, became the Victorian equivalent of virtual reality, allowing families to visit exotic locations from their sitting rooms. Public spectacles grew increasingly elaborate as the century progressed. Panoramas, massive curved paintings up to 400 feet long, depicted historical events or foreign landscapes and drew crowds of astonished spectators. Magic lantern shows projected colored images onto walls or screens, creating ghostly apparitions that delighted and terrified audiences in equal measure. P.T. Barnum's famous tours of Britain in the 1840s introduced the concept of the modern circus, with its combination of exotic animals, human oddities, and theatrical spectacle. Even traditional holidays transformed during this period. Christmas evolved from a minor religious observance into the centerpiece of Victorian family life. Prince Albert introduced the German tradition of decorated Christmas trees to Britain, while Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol cemented the holiday's association with charity and family togetherness. Christmas cards first appeared in the 1840s, and by the 1880s, over 11 million were sent annually. As those Victorian Christmas cards circulated by the millions, the British Empire was about to experience a brutal wake-up call that would transform its understanding of modern warfare. The Crimean War, raging from 1853 to 1856, marked the collision between Britain's romanticized notions of military glory and the grim realities of industrialized combat. Though fought on the distant shores of the Black Sea, this conflict would reach into Victorian parlors in unprecedented ways. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens could follow battlefield developments almost as they happened. William Howard Russell, writing for The Times, became the world's first war correspondent, sending unflinching accounts of military chaos and suffering back to London. His dispatches sparked national outrage, describing British soldiers freezing in inadequate uniforms, while military supplies rotted on docks just miles away. The Telegraph dramatically compressed the time between events and public awareness, transmitting Russell's reports across Europe within hours rather than the weeks previously required. The conflict itself stemmed from complex diplomatic maneuvering over the declining Ottoman Empire, with Russia seeking greater influence in Eastern Europe and control of strategic Black Sea routes. Britain, fearing Russian expansion toward India, the jewel in the crown of its empire, joined forces with France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Sardinia to check Russian ambitions. What followed was a catastrophic demonstration of British military unpreparedness. The siege of Sevastopol dragged on for nearly a year, exposing critical weaknesses in supply lines, command structures, and battlefield medicine. Winter brought even greater suffering as temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius. Thousands of soldiers huddled in muddy trenches with insufficient clothing, food, and shelter. An officer wrote home, quote, "Our men have not a change of anything, no beds but the muddy ground, no covering but the sky." Perhaps nothing captured the war's tragic absurdity better than the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. A miscommunication between commanders sent 670 British light cavalrymen charging directly into a valley flanked by Russian artillery on 3 sides. Within minutes, over a third of the men were killed or wounded. Lord Tennyson immortalized their sacrifice in his poem that begins, "Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. While battlefield casualties mounted, an even deadlier enemy stalked British camps. Preventable diseases, cholera, dysentery, and typhus, claimed far more soldiers than Russian bullets. In military hospitals, the wounded were packed into filthy wards with minimal medical attention. The mortality rate in these facilities reached an appalling 42%, prompting Florence Nightingale's historic intervention. Arriving with a team of 38 nurses, Nightingale found patients lying in their excrement on bare floors, surgical instruments crusted with dried blood, and sewage backing up beneath hospital buildings. Her methodical reforms, improving ventilation, nutrition, and basic hygiene, dramatically reduced mortality rates. Using innovative statistical methods, she created her famous Rose diagrams, showing precisely how preventable diseases were decimating British forces. The war also introduced other modern elements that would define future conflicts. The telegraph allowed generals to communicate across vast distances, while railways transported troops and supplies to the battlefield. Both sides employed new weaponry like rifled muskets with significantly improved range and accuracy. The French introduced the first armored floating batteries during the siege of Kinburn, precursors to modern battleships. Most revolutionary was the arrival of Roger Fenton, the first official war photographer. His carefully composed images of cannon-lined ravines and solemn officer portraits brought visual evidence of the distant conflict into Victorian homes. Though Fenton avoided photographing casualties due to technical limitations and Victorian sensibilities, his images nevertheless began to erode the romantic notions of warfare that prevailed in British society. The photographs from Crimea may have troubled Victorian sensibilities, but an even greater imperial nightmare was brewing in the East. Beneath the surface of Britain's most valuable possession, forces were converging that would transform a soldier's religious objection into the largest colonial uprising the empire had ever faced. On May 10, 1857, in the garrison town of Meerut, Indian soldiers serving under British officers took an unprecedented step. 85 sepoys had recently been imprisoned for refusing to bite cartridges they believed were grease with animal fat, forbidden by their religions. The comrades broke rank, freed the prisoners, and turned the weapons on their British commanders. By morning, the rebels had killed dozens of Europeans, including women and children, and begun marching toward Delhi. What made this rebellion different from previous localized revolts was its rapid spread. Within weeks, mutinies erupted across northern India as sepoys abandoned their posts and joined the growing insurrection. The rebels soon controlled major portions of the Gangetic Plain, including the symbolic prize of Delhi, where they proclaimed the elderly Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah II the ruler of a liberated India. The uprising transcended military ranks. Dispossessed princes, landlords, peasants, and religious leaders joined forces against British rule. Underlying grievances had been festering for decades. The East India Company's aggressive annexation policies had deposed dozens of Indian rulers, while new land revenue systems had impoverished farmers. Christian missionary activities had sparked fears of forced conversion, and technological changes like railways and telegraphs were viewed as threats to traditional ways of life. British responses shocked Victorian society when reports reached home. At Kanpur, then Kanpur, following the massacre of British women and children held hostage by rebel leader Nana Sahib, General Neil ordered captured rebels to lick the bloodstains from the floor before execution. In Delhi, whole neighborhoods were destroyed after its recapture, with thousands of civilians killed. Colonel James Neil's hanging parties executed suspects without trial, sometimes forcing Muslims to eat pork and Hindus to consume beef before death, a calculated religious humiliation. The British press portrayed these events through a distinctly imperial lens. The Illustrated London News published dramatic engravings showing brave British soldiers defending helpless women against savage attackers. Few accounts acknowledged the legitimate grievances that had sparked the uprising. Instead, the rebellion was characterized as an irrational outbreak of Oriental barbarism that justified harsh suppression. The East India Company, which had effectively ruled much of India as a commercial enterprise since the mid-18th century, couldn't survive the political fallout. In August 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, transferring all company territories directly to the British Crown. This began the period known as the British Raj, with a viceroy representing the Queen, and an elaborate administrative structure designed to prevent future uprisings. The transformation went beyond governance. Military restructuring created a deliberately unbalanced army with British soldiers outnumbering Indians in artillery and key positions. Recruitment practices shifted to focus on martial races, ethnic groups like Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Pathans, who had largely remained loyal during the rebellion, while previously dominant groups were excluded from service. Social relations hardened into rigid racial hierarchies. British officials, who had previously sometimes adopted Indian customs and taken Indian wives, now maintained strict separation from the people they governed. Colonial clubs, hill stations, and segregated neighborhoods embodied this new distance. A culture of suspicion pervaded imperial administration, with detailed intelligence reports tracking potential troublemakers and surveillance of native newspapers becoming routine. Queen Victoria's proclamation of 1858 promised religious tolerance and equal treatment, but the reality proved quite different. The British doubled down on their self-appointed civilizing mission, establishing English-language universities to create a class of Indians who were, in Macaulay's famous phrase, quote, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These Western-educated elites would later form the backbone of the independence movement that eventually ended British rule. As Britain tightened its grip on India, its imperial ambitions turned towards southern Africa, where the empire would face warriors unlike any they had encountered before. In 1879, British High Commissioner Sir Bartle Frere unilaterally issued an impossible ultimatum to King Cetshwayo of the Zulu Kingdom, demanding the disbandment of his army and acceptance of British residency. When Cetshwayo predictably rejected these terms, the Anglo-Zulu War began, a conflict the British expected to win easily against what they considered primitive opponents. The Zulu military system, however, was anything but primitive. Built around age regiments called amabuto, the Zulu army employed sophisticated battle tactics, including the buffalo horns formation, where warriors encircled enemies with deadly precision. Their soldiers underwent rigorous training, maintaining strict discipline and fighting primarily with short stabbing spears called assegai, shields made of cowhide, and clubs. On January 22, 1879, the British suffered a catastrophic defeat at Isandlwana. Nearly 1,400 British and colonial troops faced approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors. Contrary to later colonial myths, the British weren't simply overwhelmed by savage hordes. They were outmaneuvered by disciplined regiments executing complex tactics. The result was devastating. Over 1,300 British soldiers killed in what became their worst defeat against an indigenous force. The same day, just 10 miles away at Rorke's Drift Mission Station, another battle unfolded when approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors attacked a garrison of just 150 British troops. Against impossible odds, the British held their position through 12 hours of intense fighting. The defense of Rorke's Drift became legendary, with 11 Victoria Crosses awarded, the highest decoration for valor in the British military. The British eventually regrouped, and by July 1879, superior firepower had crushed Zulu resistance. The final battle at Ulundi saw British square formations, armed with artillery and Gatling guns, methodically destroy the charging Zulu forces. The kingdom was divided into 13 territories, each under a separate chief, effectively ending Zulu independence and paving the way for white settlement. 20 years later, another conflict tested Britain's imperial might, this time against the descendants of Dutch settlers known as Boers. The First Anglo-Boer War from 1880 to 1881 ended in an embarrassing defeat for Britain, but the discovery of vast gold deposits in the Transvaal region soon drew British interest back to the area. Tensions escalated as thousands of British prospectors flocked to Boer territories, creating an explosive political situation. The Second Anglo-Boer War from 1899 to 1902 began with Boer forces besieging the British in Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. Early British attempts to break these sieges resulted in a string of humiliating defeats during Black Week in December 1899. The Boers, skilled horsemen who knew the terrain intimately, employed hit-and-run tactics that frustrated conventional British military strategies. When the British finally gained the upper hand through sheer numerical advantage, the Boers shifted to guerrilla warfare. In response, Lord Kitchener implemented his notorious scorched earth policy, burning farms, destroying crops, and poisoning wells to deny Boer commandos supplies and support. Most controversially, the British established concentration camps where they interned Boer women and children along with black Africans removed from farms. Conditions in these camps were appalling. Overcrowding, inadequate food, and poor sanitation led to outbreaks of measles, typhoid, and dysentery. By the war's end, over 28,000 Boer civilians had died in the camps, most of them children under 16. At least 14,000 black Africans also perished in separate camps, though records were poorly kept. British activist Emily Hobhouse toured the camps and documented the suffering, writing, quote, "To keep these Boers alive at all costs was, in my opinion, the only humane and right course." Her reports caused outrage in Britain, where many citizens questioned the moral foundations of their empire. Liberal politician David Lloyd George denounced the camps as a, quote, policy of extermination, while opposition leader Henry Campbell Bannerman declared the methods, quote, not war, but methods of barbarism. As questions about imperial morality haunted the British conscience, a parallel revolution was unfolding in workshops and laboratories across the nation. While empires rise and fall, the legacy of Victorian innovation would endure far beyond colonial borders, reshaping humanity's relationship with the physical world in ways that continue to define our lives today. The Victorian era witnessed an unprecedented acceleration in technological development. The steam engine, already transforming Britain since the late 18th century, reached new heights of efficiency and application. By 1850, over 6,000 miles of railway track crisscrossed the country, compressing time and space in ways previously unimaginable. Villages once isolated by days of treacherous travel became accessible in hours, while goods that had languished in warehouses for weeks reached markets in a single day. Beneath the seas, a quieter revolution was brewing. In 1866, after multiple failed attempts, Cyrus Field's transatlantic telegraph cable successfully connected Europe and North America. A message that once took weeks by ship now traveled in minutes. Queen Victoria exchanged congratulatory telegrams with President Andrew Johnson, while stock prices synchronized between London and New York exchanges. When the Franco-Prussian War erupted in 1870, Britons read about battles the same day they occurred, a media immediacy we take for granted today. The Victorian cityscape transformed through technological innovation. Gas lighting, introduced early in the century, illuminated streets and extended productive hours. By the 1880s, electric lighting began its steady march through urban Britain. The first electric street lighting appeared in Newcastle in 1879, while London's financial district became electrified in 1882. The wealthy soon demanded private electrical installations. By 1890, nearly 400 private generating plants operated in London homes and businesses. In manufacturing, the sewing machine revolutionized clothing production. Isaac Singer's 1851 improvements made machine sewing accessible beyond factories. By the 1860s, the home sewing machine became a middle-class fixture. Women could produce clothing faster, while factories churned out affordable ready-made garments. Meanwhile, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, demonstrated at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, would transform business communication within decades. Domestic life experienced its own technological renaissance. Thomas Crapper didn't invent the flush toilet, contrary to popular belief, but his improvements and marketing helped popularize indoor plumbing. Elisha Otis's safety elevator, demonstrated dramatically at New York's Crystal Palace in 1854 when he cut the hoisting rope while riding his platform, transformed urban architecture and made high-rise living possible. Even laundry day saw innovation, with the first mechanical washing machines appearing in wealthier homes by the 1890s. The era's inventors achieved celebrity status unprecedented for men of science. When Isambard Kingdom Brunel's massive steamship, Great Eastern, launched in 1858, over 30,000 spectators gathered along the Thames. His railways, bridges, and ships made him a household name. Similarly, when Thomas Edison demonstrated his phonograph at London's Crystal Palace in 1888, crowds waited hours for a glimpse of the Wizard of Menlo Park and his marvelous talking machine. Not all Victorian innovations were spectacular. The humble tin can, perfected in the 1860s with the invention of the can opener, revolutionized food preservation and distribution. Rubber tires, initially developed for bicycles before automobiles existed, made transportation smoother and quieter. The safety bicycle, with its chain drive and equal-sized wheels, introduced in the 1880s, gave women unprecedented mobility and contributed to clothing reform movements. These innovations fed directly into imperial ambition. Railways built in India reduced troop movement times from weeks to days. Telegraph lines connecting colonial outposts allowed governors to receive instructions from London without delay. British technology became a calling card of empire, presented as evidence of superiority and justification for rule. When electric lighting was installed in Calcutta in 1879, the Viceroy declared it proof of Britain's civilizing mission. The dawn of 1901 brought a profound moment in British history. On January 22nd, Queen Victoria drew her final breath at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her death marked more than just the passing of a monarch. It was the end of an era that had fundamentally reshaped Britain and much of the world. As the Queen's body made its final journey to Windsor, the nation stood still, caught between reverence for the past and uncertainty about the future. Victoria's son, Edward VII, ascended the throne at age 59, already embodying a very different sensibility than his mother. Where Victoria had been known for her conservative values and sometimes severe demeanor, Edward brought a love of pleasure, leisure, and cosmopolitan tastes. The transformation at the very top of society reflected broader changes already underway through the empire. The certainties that had defined Victoria Britain were dissolving. The empire that had stretched across nearly a quarter of the globe's land surface, from Canada to Australia, India to Africa, was showing signs of strain. The Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902 had proved unexpectedly difficult and controversial, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops to defeat what was supposed to be a minor colonial opponent. In India, nationalism was stirring among educated elites who had been schooled in British universities only to find themselves denied equal opportunities. Meanwhile, international competitors were emerging. Germany's rapid industrialization and growing navy posed a direct challenge to British supremacy, while the United States was transforming into an economic powerhouse. The old assumption that Britain would forever lead the world in trade, manufacturing, and military might no longer seemed guaranteed. Domestically, social hierarchies that had seemed immutable were being challenged from multiple directions. The Labour Party was founded in 1900, giving working-class movements a formal political vote for the first time. The Women's Social and Political Union, formed in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst, brought new militant tactics to the fight for women's suffrage. Even the aristocracy faced unprecedented pressures as agricultural depression and new inheritance taxes threatened their economic foundations. The artistic world captured this atmosphere of transition and uncertainty. The late Victorian writings of Thomas Hardy portrayed a rural England disappearing under the forces of modernization. Oscar Wilde's wit masked a deeper critique of social hypocrisy. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, published in 1899, questioned the moral legitimacy of the imperial project itself. These darker, more psychological explorations hinted at the modernist movement that would flourish in the years ahead. Technology accelerated the sense of entering a new age. By 1901, electric streetlights illuminated major cities, transforming nightlife and extending the workday. The first cinemas were appearing, offering a revolutionary form of mass entertainment. Marconi had successfully transmitted radio signals across the Atlantic. The Wright brothers' first flight was just 2 years away. The automobile, though still a luxury, promised to reshape both urban design and personal mobility. The short Edwardian era that followed Victoria's death from 1901 to 1910 is often portrayed as a sunlit afternoon of garden parties and elegant country houses. While there was indeed a reaction against Victorian restraint among the upper classes, beneath the surface lay growing social tensions. The constitutional crisis of 1909 to 1911 dramatically reduced the power of the House of Lords. Labor strikes became increasingly common and militant. The suffragette movement grew more confrontational. What nobody could foresee was how completely the First World War would sweep away the world the Victorians had built. The conflict that erupted in 1914 destroyed 4 empires, killed millions, and shattered the 19th century's faith in inevitable progress. Yet even as Victorian certainties faded, Victorian infrastructure remained in railways and sewers, school systems and civil service procedures, colonial administrations, and legal codes. The Victorian era shaped the world we live in, from public health to education to the fight for fairness. It reminds us that real change comes when people demand it. If you found this journey fascinating, hit subscribe. There's more history just beneath the surface.